Hey guys, it's Judy from Nutrition with Judy. Thanks for joining me today. My name is Judy Cho, and I am a nutritional therapy practitioner. I work with clients to get to root cause healing, and oftentimes that is using a meat-based diet to work on gut health. Today, I'm so excited. I had the pleasure of sitting down and talking with Dr. Dominic or Dom D. Agostino. I am a huge fan of his work. He is an associate professor at the University of South Florida. He has done so much research and biohacking in the keto space and really moved the needle with keto as a nutritional therapy protocol. Dom teaches students at the Morsani College of Medicine and the Department of Molecular Pharmacology and Physiology. He focuses on topics such as neuropharmacology, medical biochemistry, physiology, and neuroscience. He is also a research scientist, and in the interview, you'll see a lot of the research he has done in the past and even now, and how a lot of things he tests and studies around the ketogenic diet. Well, let's get right into the interview. Hey, Dom, thank you so much for joining me today. I'm a big fan of yours. If you can introduce yourself and share your story and how you kind of got into ketogenic diets and all your research.
Yeah, sure. Well, thanks for having me, Judy. Yeah, I've been doing this research for a little over 10 years now, I would say. And I had a very high interest, personal interest in nutrition coming out of high school, I would say. Very into fitness and working out and that sort of thing. And nutrition was sort of the main lever to pull in the fitness community
Right.
when you want to increase strength and things like that. I went into a nutrition program in my undergrad, and I took PhD level, graduate level nutrition courses as an undergrad. But when I was looking to go to med school, and I entered a lab to do research, and it was a physiology neuroscience lab. So I ended up kind of getting a little maybe more interested in neuroscience, and then ultimately applied to a neuroscience program and did studied the neural control of autonomic regulation. So the brainstem mechanisms that control our respiratory rhythm and
Mhm.
sympathetic tone, and actually, recording from these neurons, that was part of what I did. And when I did my postdoctoral fellowship, it was again, my PhD was on the neural control of autonomic regulation in the context of hypoxia. And my postdoctoral fellowship was on essentially the same thing, but in the context of hyperoxia, which really
Mhm.
only occurs under hyperbaric oxygen pressures that occur in hyperbaric oxygen therapy, but also in military situations. So special operations community specifically, and they had a problem of seizures. So
Right.
that's where nutrition comes in. So I was actually very excited to be able to introduce nutrition after studying many different drugs and antioxidant cocktails. I discovered that the ketogenic diet, which I didn't have a favorable view of the ketogenic diet going through nutrition program,
Sure.
because I think we just briefly touched upon it. It was like the last resort thing you do when all drugs fail in epilepsy. And I don't remember hearing anything more about it. And then that a protein sparing modified fast could kill you because it would, you'd be deficient in certain nutrients and things like that. So I did not have but I knew personally that carbohydrate restriction was a very effective way to promote body composition alterations, fat loss. So I knew that, and I knew in the fitness and bodybuilding community that it was quite popular to do a ketogenic diet
Right.
for changing your body. But I did not know there was actually a lot of research behind the ketogenic diet for seizures. And central nervous system oxygen toxicity seizures manifest as a grand mal or tonic-clonic seizure. And what's interesting about the ketogenic diet was that it tends to work for seizures like Lennox-Gastaut syndrome, Dravet syndrome, and many other uh, seizure promoting pathologies independent of the etiology, meaning
Okay.
that, you could have temporal lobe epilepsy, you could have, all different forms, absent seizures, and then the ketogenic diet tends to work. And that was very interesting to me. So I wrote many different proposals and finally got one funded by the Department of Defense to study nutritional ketosis, but they did not like the ketogenic diet because it's high in fat, right? So this is like, maybe we'll touch upon this and the dangers of fat, not only for cardiovascular health, but also for like performance. It was a special operations community. So my task was to develop a ketogenic diet in a pill. So I worked on that, and some things worked and some things didn't. So we threw away the things that didn't, and I focused on the ketogenic compounds that had the highest neuroprotective anti-seizure effects. And then we also evaluated the things that could preserve and enhance physical performance, or we measure motor function. So like a little rat running on a treadmill kind of device. So, and things that increase the performance, we kept those and throw away things that don't work. So as we, and fast forward 10 years, so I did that about 10 years ago, fast forward 10 years from now, and now we study ketogenic diets and exogenous ketone supplementation and the combination of the two in many different animal models of diseases, from Angelman syndrome, Kabuki syndrome, absence seizures, cancer models, Alzheimer's models, all sorts of things. And we've moved a number of things into human clinical trials. So, and now we're looking at weight loss and cardiometabolic markers too. I'm in the middle of a trial, but I'm blinded, but I see the data coming in, and it's interesting to look at the insulin levels and other cardiometabolic markers. So it's been quite a wild ride, focusing mostly on seizures, but it going in many different directions.
That's pretty cool that, over the years, it's become more nutritionally supported in terms of the ketogenic diet. Out of curiosity, did the Department of Defense ever switch to, okay, maybe the diet, the nutritional component itself is okay, and it's not just the pill form that we need for the protective mechanisms?
Yes, they have.
Okay.
I serve on different study sections. I'll say that, and serving over the years in different study sections. 5 years ago, maybe a little bit earlier, 5 or 7 years ago, you would never see anything like ketogenic diet relating coming in. But now I get called so often because I'm sort of like maybe a thought leader in this area,
Mhm.
and I'm just overwhelmed with sort of federal requests to review ketogenic diet protocols for everything from viral illnesses to cancer to performance to hypoxia. And I think it's because of more of a mainstream interest in ketogenic diets, and funding agencies realize, okay, maybe there's something to this. They probably poke around a little bit and say, okay, so many people, millions of people are doing this and they're not dropping dead. So and the scientific rationale seems to exist for them to propose for different applications. So it really, the research has exploded. You just do a Google search, and a PubMed search would probably be
Right.
more. And in 2016, 17, there was like a lot of discussion. Oh, the interest in ketogenic diets has peaked. It's a fad diet, and it's you're not going to hear about it another year or two. But it has, the trajectory continues to go up. And for me, I just look at clinicaltrials.gov and PubMed as an indication. And if you look at clinicaltrials.gov, that's actually going up even more exponentially. And when those studies get published,
Right.
that's like looking into the future, like 5 years from now, right? Because it takes a while to get that work. So the interest will only increase, at least in the next 5 to 10 years, based upon, the window of things I'm looking through: federal grants, clinicaltrials.gov, things like that.
That's such good news to hear. I mean, especially since the 2020 to 2025 dietary guidelines came out, and
Yeah.
they lowered sugar a little bit, but they're still anti-saturated fats and meats. And so, I mean, that's good to hear. Maybe that will push that group of people to, change their opinion, especially if more papers get published saying that a ketogenic diet is also beneficial for other groups of people other than people that have, neurological imbalances and such. So,
Yeah. I would like to, just say that, uh, we study the ketogenic diet in the context of a deficit. So that deficit could be a genetic disorder, it could be a metabolic disorder, it could be a brain disease, it could be insulin resistance. Uh, with that said, it has definite therapeutic applications. It is also within the spectrum of diets that humans can consume. Obviously, is it ideal for someone to follow a ketogenic diet all the time? I think maybe we may get to these questions. Is the carnivore diet ideal? Is the vegan diet ideal? If you follow a vegan diet, it's also within the spectrum and it could promote survival, but would it be optimal? So that's the question of what is the optimal diet. And I think that for many of your listeners or watchers, or the question of what is the optimal diet involves a little more nuanced discussion than what is a diet that will move the needle on certain disorders.
Right. And, kind of going into those nuances, when I first started a ketogenic diet, I looked into so much of your research and it was so fascinating. And then I just followed some of your lifestyle. So I remember specifically that your cholesterol markers had gone up on a ketogenic diet.
Yeah.
And I know you're a little bit of that biohacker. And so you said, I'm going, and I think you said, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you started eating more wild sardines and just eating a little bit more fish just in case. So do you still do that? Are you still concerned about, we all understand that cholesterol kind of goes up, depends on LDL, HDL, triglycerides, all of those markers. But is there a certain point? So one, do you still do the fish and focus on that to lower your cholesterol markers? But on top of that, within the ketogenic space, I guess of more of the research that's been coming out, is there a certain cap that the LDL does get concerning even on a ketogenic or carnivore diet?
Yeah, all good questions. A little bit to unpack there, but I'll just from a personal standpoint. When I followed the ketogenic diet, I had a book. Maybe I have it at home now, but I had a book by the Johns Hopkins group by Dr. John Freeman, the late John Freeman, and then he mentored Dr. Eric Kossoff, who then developed the modified ketogenic diet, which was much more liberal in protein, which is sort of like the diet that I follow. But that diet then in 2008 was then used for adult epilepsy. Mm-hmm. But for pediatric epilepsy, that was really the only diet, was the what you would call the conventional ketogenic diet, or the original ketogenic diet, which is like 88%, 90% fat. So I started following that diet just out of curiosity, because I started reading so much more about ketones, and I was kind of new to, revisiting nutrition again, during my fellowship. And then as I kind of transitioned into a tenure track associate professor position, I continued with dietary research, but many thought it would be academic suicide to steer away from drugs into that. But I knew that this worked. And I wanted to find out personally, like, how it worked and how it made you feel. Right. But the plan for a ketogenic diet was very high dairy. So that's how you actually get your calories, because dairy was, it was easy to get that amount of calories. And for kids, they would have those issues with them stunting their growth and things like that, because the calories were a little too restricted. But come to find out, it was actually the protein was too restricted. Right. So there was that's a whole another discussion. But for me to follow a ketogenic diet without losing a lot of weight and a lot of muscle, I had to really get a lot of calories from just drinking heavy cream and using a lot of butter and egg yolks and things like that. And it was primarily, I found personally, and I think the data and other people's experience that I communicate with would support this, is that the dairy fat, so dairy fat's much, much higher proportionally in saturated fat relative to steak, which is actually quite high in monounsaturated fats, or chicken, or even an egg yolk is like oleic acid. Mostly it's like monounsaturated fats. Has some saturated fat too, but dairy fat is proportionally much, much higher in saturated fat. And I was literally getting over 200 grams a day of dairy fat. And when I backed that down to, gradually backed it down to 50 grams a day my LDL went from really high, double the upper level, back down to the upper level, and now it's actually within the normal range, the upper normal range. And the thing that really changed for me was just lowering the saturated fat, eating more monounsaturated fat, and then polyunsaturated fats. Eating a lot of fish too, switching and getting a lot of fish, introducing sardines. Packed in olive oil. I eat a wide variety of fish, but I still eat quite a lot of beef and some pork and some chicken, turkey. We live on a farm and we have cows, and our neighbors have free range eggs. This morning I made eggs, and I had eggs from Walmart. And I had an array of eggs. I had Eggland's Best Eggs, my neighbor's free range eggs, and then I had some eggs from Walmart that we just happened to have. And I cracked 3 of them in a pan, and each one was distinctly different in the yolk. And it ranged from the intense yellowish, orangish color was the free range eggs from my neighbors that he gives me. They all kind of taste the same, but obviously, the nutrition is different in eggs. And I eat a lot of eggs, a lot of steak, a lot of fish, and I backed off on dairy, and that has really significantly improved my LDL numbers. And I think it's important to measure ApoB too, relative to just LDL-C. And LDL-P too is also kind of important.
So in the carnivore space, I see people, they don't eat a ton of dairy, but their LDLP, I think some people I've seen are in the 1500s. And I see
Yeah,
people, it's like they eat a lot of
that's
liver,
normal.
they eat a
Yeah,
lot of organ meats, and some people are even in the 3000. So is there
yeah.
an, a cap that you would find concerning, or is it just TBD?
That's a really, really good question. I get asked this question a lot. If all other, I feel like kind of like on autopilot. Like if all other biomarkers, your blood pressure, your hemoglobin A1C, HSCRP, triglycerides, if many other things are in range, 1500's not, from my opinion, not that bad. Mine was as high as 2600, I think.
Okay.
At one point, I think with NMR, it was like 32. That's like the first. So what typically happens though, even if you're not changing your diet, if you're on a super high saturated fat dairy-based diet or carnivore diet or whatever, the first 3 months, you're going to see some pretty big anomalies in and then after 3 months, after 12 weeks, you start to see numbers start to normalize, but for many people, they do stay persistently high. Um, but if it's in the context of a calorie deficit, sometimes the numbers normalize as the person's body weight normalized. But then you have people who do lose weight. They're in a calorie deficit. They're improved so many different things, but they still have a persistent elevation of LDL-P and LDL. So the question is this a protracted suicide? Are you? And I think we do not have enough information what these single biomarkers mean in the context of a ketogenic diet or just a low carb diet. We
Right.
don't have enough information yet. But I would be uncomfortable. I'm not comfortable with an LDL-P above 2000. I'm not comfortable with that. So I did, and I know, at least from my experience, everybody is different. Everybody's a unique metabolic entity, but I've looked at enough blood work to know that if you can make some dietary changes and bring that down, and I think that's a prudent thing to do.
Yeah. And I think that makes a lot of sense. One thing you mentioned was the ApoB. Why is it important to check that marker against, and especially not just looking at LDL?
I'm not a lipidologist, but I try to absorb everything that Ronald Krauss, is putting out, and met with him on occasion, and also Peter Attia too.
Hmm.
I think it's a better reflection, a better
Okay.
indicator of what's happening. It's a better atherogenic marker especially in the context of a low carb diet and high fat
Okay.
diet. So, and there's different reasons for that, and I'm not so much of an expert. I do get asked this question a lot, and I'm still trying to understand the literature. I don't know, I could turn my computer and show you a stack of papers, but I think from my perspective, if all the other biomarkers are going in the right direction, and this is going in the wrong direction,
Mhm.
I'm not that concerned unless it's like above 2,500, the
Okay.
LDLP at least. Um, but I think it's good. So we just had this discussion right before getting on. This is that we need to start measuring ApoB, and because in addition to LDL for the study that we're currently doing, and I think the value of that is going to be important because I'm still trying to understand the numbers from from comparing many things. It's really important to capture data all at the same time. So, and we can talk about continuous glucose monitoring and measuring insulin
Right.
and measuring a whole host of cardiometabolic markers in addition to the whole spectrum of the lipid profile, and for that data to be collected at a specific time point. So that's kind of what we're doing now. And I'm still trying to make sense of the data, but I can tell you that there's a pretty high degree of variability between people, more variable than I thought, to the point where we don't have enough statistical power. So we have to, I'm doing IRB modifications to actually like double the amount of participants in our study
Got it.
because there's quite a lot of variability. And I would emphasize that maybe to your listeners too, that, if somebody's experiencing something that's not, may not be reflective, will probably not be reflective of what you're going to experience. Like you really need to go to the literature, and we need more studies on this.
Yeah, I mean, I've checked several or many, cholesterol panels, and I'm obviously not an expert, but they vary, and the diet within a carnivore ketogenic diet will vary too. And so it's just interesting that we're not all wired the same, absolutely. And then people are, well, maybe it's the genes, maybe certain, ApoE genes, or there's certain markers that will then make it harder for us to digest saturated fats. There were
Yeah,
two specific genes that someone brought up to me, and I forgot what exactly they are, but
there's a
it just,
lot.
yeah, okay.
Yeah, fatty acid oxidation. There's like 30. Actually, we were going
Oh,
through
wow.
that.
Okay.
You can have, I'm going through all the different fatty acid oxidation disorders. There's disorders where people can't make ketones. There's where, if they fast, they literally will have a seizure and
Oh,
faint and
wow.
have a
Okay.
seizure. So, and there's a spectrum, like people may have SNPs where they're just not like a robust, they do not have robust fatty acid oxidation, for
Mhm.
example, in the liver or even the skeletal muscle, and it might be on a spectrum. So they just might feel unwell if they follow a higher fat diet, and their level of fat tolerance is low. Maybe they don't make certain lipase enzymes, the
Right.
pancreas. They might get pancreatitis. So I've seen a couple examples of that where other people just thrive, eating fat. So there is really a spectrum, and some people say, well, just stick with it and adapt to it. But I've communicated with people who just can't adapt to the
Yeah.
ketogenic diet. So I think, and some people kind of feel like almost guilty they're doing it wrong. It's like I just
Right.
need to stick with it, and well, no, well, maybe this approach is not for you. And I know, I do study the ketogenic diet in the context of seizures, and I think in that case it has a lot of important benefits, and people should stick with it more, especially if they fail drug therapy. But if you're just doing it as a lifestyle approach or a weight loss approach, there are many. This is just one of many, many tools where you can create a caloric deficit to lose weight. Low carb for sure, but ketogenic, just I think people need to keep in mind that it's quite a restrictive diet. It's on that spectrum of things that humans can tolerate, but is it optimal? That's a more important question.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So I have clients where their blood glucose will go down, their A1C looks better over the months, and CRP, but there's still very little ketones are produced. So their blood sugars in the mornings look good. They're, within range of a person that doesn't have prediabetes, but their ketones will be less than zero point 0.5. And so they're like, maybe I'm not eating enough fat, or maybe, there's so many thoughts of, okay, maybe my body's become super sufficient in burning my ketones. So now I don't see it in the blood. But maybe, like you're saying, it's that this diet is not as ideal for them, because some of these people obviously have lower energy and that's why they're working with me. But what are some ways that then they could test like that this diet isn't for them?
Well, just jumping back to the point of ketone measurements too. So your blood ketone is a function of ketone production and ketone utilization, right? And if I consume exogenous ketones and then I can measure how fast it clears from my blood, it's kind of like a ketone tolerance test,
Okay.
right? And that's for someone who's sedentary, typically that it stays elevated a little bit longer, but for other people, it can get cleared pretty fast. Like your tissue, there's a very high tissue uptake of ketones. The brain uses ketones quite a bit. So keep that in mind. And I actually think in the context of like intermittent fasting and a weight loss diet, breath ketones are a more viable measurement of that, because your acetones, it's volatile organic compound and you're blowing it off. And when I actually do a 72-hour fast, my blood beta hydroxybutyrate tends to go up, and then it kind of like stays around 2.5. And if I just go for a little walk, it almost goes down to like 0.5.
Oh,
But I
wow.
know I didn't stop ketone production. My ketone production went up, but my ketone utilization increased because of physical movement
Right.
and just moving more of the ketones into the tissues. Whereas my breath acetone will go up. And in many ways, it's a more satisfying ketone to measure because it's true fat oxidation. Like you can kind of feel when your body is in this, like when you're fasting, it's high fat oxidation. You can taste it on your breath. Like you're just
Right.
fat's melting off your body. You can almost see it in the mirror. And that's when my breath ketones is actually pinning the Biosense breath acetone meter, which I use. I've used a couple different devices. So I would, if people do not have high blood ketones, I would recommend, maybe trying a breath ketone device.
Okay.
And that has been very, very insightful for me to use this device. And I know certain apps are going to integrate it into it, like the Zero Fasting app and other. This is a device used mostly for clinical research, but it's becoming more of a biohacker kind of device. So I steered us off on a little bit of a tangent, but what was your other question? Sorry.
No, no.
Yeah.
I think that's good. I mean, I remember when I first was started a ketogenic diet. I went to KetoCon, one of the first ones, and there were, people selling obviously the ketone monitor via your blood, and then there were the breath analyzers. But I think there was a period where it just didn't pick up. I think it's picking up a lot more now, mainstream. But there was something about it, like it has to be perfect breaths, or there was something that wasn't as user friendly, and it just didn't
Mhm.
work as well. But they always touted back then, like these are the true ketones that you're using in your system, versus the blood may just be like floating amounts and not
Yeah.
necessarily what you're using. So it's not a great test to see, are you truly producing enough, or if you're just utilizing it and you just won't know with the blood.
There are caveats to measuring breath ketones. One
Okay.
is if you've had a glass of wine within 15 minutes,
Okay.
it's going to show you're going to get a false positive.
Oh,
You really don't want to be eating and drinking while you're using it, at least in the last 15 minutes. That and so the Biosense device by Readout Health is a little bit different than some of the other devices. The Ketonics was relatively good, and a couple other level I think is another. But the Biosense device, when you blow into it, and then it takes just it does deep lung. So you blow
mhm.
into it, and it's not measuring that. But towards the end of the breath, then it captures that, which is deep lung, and that's sort of the patent technology that they have. And that's probably why my numbers correlate much better
Mm.
with beta hydroxybutyrate. And if I'm on a eukalorie diet and I'm not like in a calorie deficit and I'm just sitting at my desk and not running around and everything, and this is published, I think they've published papers on it, that my beta hydroxybutyrate blood level, it correlates very well with acetone. But when I started using this device and I was fasting and doing other things, I was like, your device definitely does not. I was criticizing them and saying, your device is not correlating with my beta hydroxybutyrate. And you publish this, and it's like, my data is not supporting what you're publishing. So we kind of looked into it a little bit more. My friend Peter Attia also did it and found like the same thing, like his breath acetone was coming up, and is, relative to his blood beta hydroxybutyrate, it was proportionally higher. So, the more I looked into this and the more I studied it myself and started asking other people to make measurements, what was clearly happening is that when you're in a calorie deficit, when you're fasting, your fat oxidation is quite high.
Okay.
But in a calorie deficit, your tissues more or less get more hungry, and there's greater tissue disposal of the ketones from the blood, and that's why it might not be climbing. So that's why under many conditions, I kind of prefer the breath, and then you don't have to buy the strips, you don't have to prick your finger, you just blow into the device, and it's kind of a little bit easier too. But I like pricking my finger anyway, so it's not like a big turn off to me to measure blood. But what I do, I like to measure blood. I'll even measure urine and breath, and then look at everything together when I'm really testing and I
Oh,
want
that
to
makes sense.
understand something. Yeah, if I really want to understand a ketogenic diet, like because I tried different types of ketogenic diets, if I want to understand a ketone supplement or a ketone ester, or if I want to understand what's happening in my body during a fasting experiment.
I know that there's all these nuances we just mentioned, but is there a ketone amount that's ideal to see in the breath and the blood when being on a ketogenic diet?
Uh, if you're not trying to manage like a disorder,
Hmm.
most people are not going to register. Most people have like zero point 0.1, maybe when they wake up 0.2 or 3 level of ketones. So if you're a blood level of 0.5 to 1 millimolar, you're like, you know, literally like 500 times more. It's your breath ketones are your ketone level, blood, urine, or breath, is directly proportional to the amount of fat that you're oxidizing. So the liver is, beta oxidation of fatty acids contributes to the production of acetyl-CoA, and that condenses to acetoacetate and then beta hydroxybutyrate, and then that spills into the blood. The main ketone in circulation is beta hydroxybutyrate. It's in a ratio of acetoacetate to about 4 to 1 to 3 to 1, and then acetoacetate spontaneously decarboxylates to acetone. Then you can measure that. So when those things are elevated, that these ketones are not elevated in like a normal person eating a
Okay.
standard diet. When you carbohydrate restrict or fast, the presence of those is indicative that you're in a high fat oxidation state. So if someone wants to confirm that they are actually indeed shifting away from glycolysis towards being fat adapted, keto adapted, there's no really, I can't think of any other better. If you measure insulin, I guess, well, that's another subject we can get into, but ketones are the easiest way to show that you are fat adapted, really. And I think that's important for most people, especially trying to lose weight.
But does it matter if you in the morning, like when I first started a ketogenic diet, sometimes my ketones were like 7.0. I never get that now. So now they're maybe 1.5. So I do run on the
Mhm.
higher end of in general, but a lot of my clients, they're at point 0.3, point 0.4,
Mhm.
and they don't eat any carbohydrates. Now they eat a, meat-based diet. So their protein's probably a little bit higher. So they probably see the effects of the gluconeogenesis, and their blood sugar tends to run a little bit higher than if you're on a ketogenic diet, but within under 100. Um, but is there a range that you'd want to see in the morning? So is someone that has like zero point 0.5 less fat adapted or less fueled by fat than somebody that has like 2.0 in the morning?
Yeah, so morning can vary, and our morning hormonal physiology varies in individuals. Like some
Sure.
people have a more of a dawn effect,
Mhm.
and so I've been measuring insulin, and with a CGM device, I'm measuring glucose too. So what I think is happening, I measure cortisol too,
Okay.
and which is in the normal range, even relative to if I was on a higher carb diet. What I think is happening in people that are on low carb diets, ketogenic diets, is that they produce proportionally more glucagon.
Okay.
So, you have a glucagon, insulin glucagon ratio, and people, just don't measure glucagon. So
Yeah.
that's why, in the study we're doing now, we want to measure glucagon. It's something that people, I'm going to put myself out there and saying that the low ketones that people are experiencing in the morning may be due to some extent in elevated cortisol, driving gluconeogenesis, but glucagon, higher glucagon is probably what's going on. There's some data to indicate that. Especially, we do know that elite athletes who are choosing to use a low carb approach definitely have higher glucagon levels.
Okay.
And so we only understand it at this point in time in the context of elite athletes, but they're also pushing their bodies really hard. So they're sort of maybe in a little bit more catabolic state. But I think that's kind of what's going on. And maybe some people have higher levels of glucagon. And I kind of trend, I definitely have lower ketones in the morning, and then by mid-afternoon and evening, that's when my ketones peak.
Okay.
So I think it's important to measure ketones across the spectrum of the day, so you get a better picture. Morning ketones probably not the most accurate
Okay.
time to measure ketones, just because our metabolic physiology is probably most variable in the morning when we wake up. Some people do have a pretty dramatic sort of activation of sympathetic nervous system, cortisol, glucagon, glucagon insulin ratio.
Quick question, just to clarify for the audience, what is glucagon? And then if your glucagon is higher, is that necessarily a bad thing on a low carb diet?
Yeah, well, glucagon is in simple terms, it's the antagonist to insulin. It is a hormone that's released in the context of calorie restriction, fasting, sympathetic nervous system activation. It triggers lipolysis. It triggers glycogenolysis. It is a catabolic hormone. Insulin is a storage hormone, so we store glucose and lipids and triglycerides in adipose tissue. So they tend to be, not always, but they tend to be inversely related.
Yes.
So you eat a high carb meal, insulin goes up, glucagon will be down. You skip a couple meals, you're under stress, you need to mobilize glucose for fuel, but you're not eating carbohydrates. So what happens is that glucagon is released, and that can trigger gluconeogenesis and glycogenolysis, and help increase and get that glucose into circulation so we can use it for fuel. So I think it's a normal part of our physiology to wake up and want to, we need high energetic demands for our brain. It's like you're starting the engine to your car. There's a lot of systems that come online when you wake up, right? So you're moving your body and things like that. So it's a normal and appropriate response for our metabolic physiology to get more glucose into circulation in anticipation. And a lot of it's behavioral too. So if you're on vacation or if you're doing something, there's an anticipatory effect, and a couple of publications on this that I need to look into more. But there's sort of an anticipatory effect. If you have to wake up early to go to the airport or something like that, I can see it on my CGM, for example. Mm-hmm. So there's a behavioral component, and the behavioral component to eating and glucose control and things like that is a whole nother complex subject that is very fascinating to me. And we're studying components of that now.
Yeah, I can imagine. I mean, I would think that glucagon would also vary depending on the person. So someone like me who's more out maintenance, maybe my glucagon will be lower than somebody that is obese and on a ketogenic diet. And then now having to tap into those fuel sources within the body, their glucagon might be higher, and that might be normal compared to what might be normal for me. So I could see all of those things vary. But one of the questions I asked you prior when we were going off on the tangent is, so are there any markers that we can figure out, okay, maybe this ketogenic diet, maybe a low carb diet's ideal, but not as far as a ketogenic diet?
So you're asking me what markers can we measure to
Mhm.
determine if a ketogenic diet is ideal as a lifestyle kind of
Yeah,
diet, right? It's a good question. So I, I kind of a little story, background story, I guess maybe 10, 12 years ago, I maybe gave a talk. It might have been the American Epilepsy Association or something, where I was kind of casually mentioned in the middle of my talk that I was on a ketogenic diet and I was following the Johns Hopkins protocol. And someone asked me later, I think we are at a poster or something. It's like, oh, I did not know you had epilepsy. How long have you had? So it was very strange, even years ago, that because there was no news about
sure.
ketogenic diet. So I embraced the diet primarily from a research standpoint to understand what it felt like running on ketones. And it's not like your brain runs on glucose or ketones. So the homeostatic mechanisms that maintain your blood glucose are very powerful, like glucagon, gluconeogenesis. So glucose really doesn't go down that much.
Mhm.
Um, but when ketones are elevated, they do provide an alternative energy substrate to your brain, and they are not just an energy substrate. It's ketones are like a hormone, and they activate many different pathways. There's ketone receptors. There's epigenetic regulation, beta hydroxybutyrylation, which is a topic of my student's PhD right now, studying Kabuki syndrome. But to get back to the topic, I started following a ketogenic diet, and I gravitated toward eating a ketogenic diet through the the beginning and through the whole tenure process, and the fact because it increased my work productivity.
Mm.
I didn't get hungry. I had more energy flow. So I did it for two reasons, primarily research, but I gravitated to eating this way just because I felt better and I didn't have the fluctuations and the dips in energy and things like that. So I embraced this as in the beginning, I did the classical ketogenic diet and then gravitated to a modified ketogenic diet, which I do now.
Okay.
And I want to be as agnostic as possible about dietary choices. I do think we are omnivores. I don't think a carnivore diet is optimal. I think it can be for some people, but I question whether that would be the optimal approach. So to go back to your question a little bit, so you have two different things. There's objective biomarkers and then there's subjective effects. Subjectively, I feel that a low carb ketogenic diet, and some days I just do completely carnivore. But that's rare because I would prefer not to do carnivore, but sometimes I just don't have like salads and I need to go to the store or whatever.
Mhm.
uh, but but the biomarkers, we do a cardiometabolic profile, which is the biomarkers that I think are most appropriate are continuous glucose monitoring,
Okay.
and I'd have to plug, the devices that are out there, the Dexcom, the Abbott Libre. I use Levels Health as a platform that I view my CGM data on. So that's a very, very insightful. And if you go from a normal diet to a low carb diet or ketogenic diet, your blood glucose regulation is like perfect. Like
Yeah.
you are always stay within a certain range. And I think that will promote steady fuel flow to the brain, higher productivity, more satiation, just from the combination of the fat and the protein together. But from cardiometabolic standpoint, we don't talk about it much, but blood pressure is something to measure a lot. So glucose, insulin, hemoglobin A1C, triglycerides. If your triglycerides start to become elevated, and they become elevated maybe initially, that suggests that you're not digesting, assimilating, and using the fat for fuel very well at the level of the mitochondria. So you're
Right.
getting a buildup of triglycerides. If your triglycerides remain elevated and you're losing weight, that would really suggest that you're not. But typically what people see is that paradoxically, they could double and even triple the amount of fat that they're eating, lower their carbohydrate consumption, insulin goes down, and that promotes higher fat oxidation, triglycerides go down. So when I started following the ketogenic diet, I did quite a lot of blood work, and I tripled or quadrupled my fat intake, and my triglycerides literally went almost in half, I think. And I remember explaining this to my doctor, and he was like, really, he was like, no, this can't be. And we did it again. So I was I was very naive going into the ketogenic diet. I didn't realize that this was actually a thing that could happen. Some people had written about it, but I think it's also reflecting because I was, working out a lot, and I was pretty metabolically fit at the time. So I was a really good fat oxidizer. But
Right.
you have scenarios, and I've seen it in kids, and I've seen it sometimes medication can cause it, where they go on a ketogenic diet and they have persistently elevated triglycerides. So that is really the biggest indication that the ketogenic diet may not be for you. Carnivore, higher fat diet may not be for you. Um, Under all situations, though, I think a lower carb diet is optimal. So I think it's hard to argue. Well, the standard American diet is not optimal, but I think carnivore diet's on the spectrum of what humans can eat. A vegan diet is on the spectrum of what humans can eat. I do not think either diet is optimal, but I do think a low carbohydrate diet is optimal for humans. And that's an omnivorous, carnivore-like-ish diet. And I just, I think if you exclude meat from the diet, that's not optimal.
Okay.
I think some meat in the diet's really is sort of is needed for proper nutrition. Then again, if I do think I have some thoughts about a carnivore diet that I've seen that you can get, it's like a hyper nutrition diet. And if you are, and I've seen this in guys that are trying to bulk up on a carnivore diet, eating lots of liver and things like that, that it's like overnutrition, and I think it's taxing out the liver with too much B vitamins, too much iron. Iron's probably the biggest. I get blood work. I get my blood. I give blood every, as much as I can, and I think there's some side effects of following a carnivore diet, and that there's too much nutrition in the context of a weight loss diet. So when you're calorie restricting, then it becomes optimal because you're getting an extremely dense form of nutrition.
Yes.
And if you're in the context of a calorie deficit, now that's optimal because it will prevent nutritional deficiencies. So that's my opinion. And I think a vegan diet in the context of calorie restriction can do the opposite. So I'd go out on a limb and kind of say that. I know maybe I'll be attacked for that, but
No,
I
it's
think,
so crazy that you're bringing this up because I randomly ran into this. I think I'm one of the few people in the internet world of things that get blood work with clients. And I started seeing, and I get hair mineral tissue tests, and I started seeing excess nutrients in people. And I was like, what is going on? I see excess copper. I see excess chromium. In some of the hair mineral. And then I started seeing some of the nitrogen going up and just started doing research on liver, bile, and everything. And even vitamin A, there's so much literature on hypervitaminosis A. And I started wondering, okay, like you said, if you are eating very little, if you're under eating, so then every single bite counts, then liver may be ideal, right? So maybe 1 ounce. But you can also get inundated with too much copper from liver. And so I just started, dotting the lines, and everything that certain people were in excess hypervitaminosis or minerals, it was from, like, liver was one, right? So maybe, like you said, I started thinking, oh my gosh, some people are like, well, liver's so good for us. Well, let's just eat a pound a day or half a pound, and they're getting too much nutrition. And then it becomes a tax on your liver, which has to produce bile,
yeah,
right? Which has
yeah.
to break down the fat. So if your LDL's going up, maybe it's not because you're not able to digest fat naturally, but because you're taxing the liver. And I started seeing that. And when I brought it up, of course, people were upset in the carnivore community. But it's
Yeah.
so, I love that you're bringing this up because I am completely on the same page. So I'm more of a fan of, if you want to do carnivore long term, you have to eat a rainbow and be really smart with what you eat. So what I mean by rainbow, I mean add the sardines, the salmon. But a lot of people are like, well, there's like mercury toxicity, or there's PFOAs in the water, and all these things. And it's just, so then just eat beef. And it's like, no, but beef doesn't even have a lot of thiamine, even if you eat the liver, right? So it's just little nuances that I've been picking up with my clients, but there's not a lot of talk about it. And carnivore is so new, not a lot of people are researching it. And so
Yeah.
it's really fascinating.
It's interesting that you do the hair analysis. And do you mind telling me what kit you use? If you can give,
Yeah,
because I'm trying to remember my kit and I want to know if it's the same one you're
so I
using.
think they were called the TEI or the Trace Elements. They're based in Addison, Texas. So I think the guy that owns that company, and there's this one other company, and they used to be one of the same, and then they kind of split off from each
Okay.
other. But they
Yeah.
do the same thing. And then there's, I think it's from Doctor's Data. I think
Oh,
that's the
doctor's
other.
data. That's what I was trying to
Okay.
remember.
There's
Doctor's
an,
data.
so they do
So I
something.
use that.
Okay.
Yeah.
What were your thoughts on that?
Well, so this got brought to my attention actually talking with Joe Rogan. I was on his
Oh, interesting.
podcast, but I
Okay.
think even offline he had mentioned that, hey, that the sardines increase your mercury level or something. And I can only vouch for the type of sardines I was eating, and I looked for other like bisphenol A and I don't know different
Right.
things that they put in the can linings
Sure.
too. Like I measured that too. I'm trying to Wild Planet. Okay, so it was yeah. I was eating like 6 cans of Wild Planet sardines a day every day.
A day? Wow.
So
Okay.
yeah, yeah. On top of buying some fish at the store and things like that. We live on a farm too, so I catch fish sometimes.
Okay.
But so I did a hair sample, months after massive consumption of canned fish and some tuna fish here and there too. And it was like in the low range. It was like within the healthy range. It was
Sure.
kind of trending like a little bit higher than normal, but within the normal range. And I've seen other things where people who don't eat any fish are like sky high and everything.
Yeah.
But generally, and the bar was pretty low on that. So on this particular test. So because I asked other people to do the test too, and some people were higher than me and they don't eat any sardines.
I
So
know.
it just basically confirmed that at least as brand Wild Planet. And I like to eat fish that are lower on the food chain.
Yes.
I do think that if I was eating a lot of swordfish or other things,
Yeah.
I'd probably had that pinned out on that. Just based, I read a lot of, I looked at a lot of forums and stuff online who use the same test, and they were eating like a lot of tuna and sashimi and things like that, and they were very high. So I think if you're going to eat fish and you want to incorporate it in a regular, I think you're pretty safe. Sardines, at least from Wild Planet, they seem to be getting it from a pretty good source based upon my test.
Yeah, I agree with you. So, I don't know, the internet's good and bad. You get a lot of information, but you also get a lot of fear mongering. And so now every
Hmm.
time I share about fish, people are always like, "Aren't you worried about the toxicity in the waters?" And just from all the hair minerals I've done, and I've done
Hmm.
over several hundred now, and a lot of them eat some fish, some don't eat at all, but the mercury is all over the map, right? So it could be from
Yeah.
even our soils, it could be from some of the processed foods that we consume. We just don't know. Sometimes it's just balancing other minerals. And there's just it could be from amalgams, right? It could be from your mom. There's just so many places you could get it.
Hmm.
But I think if you were to weigh the pros and cons, the benefits of sardines and salmon roe, they're just so nutritionally dense with
Hmm.
less risk of hypervitaminosis or toxicity. And that's why I'm a fan of fish, even though it's not the most desirable, especially on a carnivore diet, but it's just
Yeah.
smarter, right?
And for women too, looking to get pregnant. So they, some at the time, I think my research associate, Dr. Angela Poff, she was my first graduate student. She's still in the lab, but I was kind of curious, not necessarily for her, but I was, conveying the information to her too. And I wanted to do this because I wanted to understand what fish was doing to my body. But I know for women who are pregnant or looking to get pregnant, I think fish and omega-3s offer a lot of benefits for the developing brain. And I guess you can get it in supplements and stuff too, but then you don't know, could have heavy metals in that. But I don't think, I think that we are potentially scaring women away from a super nutritious food source that can aid in the development, of the baby. And maybe that's the case for other fish, but for certain brands of, fish, like small fish, like sardines, I think it might even be better than eating chicken or other, maybe even like rice, which is grown in tainted soil or something like that, which could be high in heavy metals. I remember about 10 years ago, someone told me that, this is going to be a big, big problem, like rice, like arsenic in rice or
Oh
heavy
yeah.
metals in rice. And I had never heard anything about it. And then a few years later, I saw some studies coming out on heavy metals in rice and grains, in the soil.
Yes, I've
So,
had a few kids do the mineral test, and their arsenic is high in their aluminum. And so with the arsenic, I
mhm.
always have to ask if they're having any, like the rice crackers, the pincher grass little snacks that are made of rice, especially when we're getting away from gluten. So then it's the rice that they're eating, or the corn puffs, or the rice puffs,
Yeah.
and a lot of them are.
I have a question for you,
Yes.
if you don't mind. Glyphosate. So I grew up on a farm spraying a lot of glyphosate, not wearing protective gear. We live on a
Okay.
farm now. We phased all that stuff out. But I do, and I've never done the test for glyphosate. And I've been just, I kind of wanted my body to recover a little bit because I didn't want to scare myself too much. But is that something that you measured in yourself, and do you measure in clients, and do you see that it has an impact?
That's a good
Or are
question.
you on the
So
fence about it?
yeah, no. So in my Carnivore Cure book, I did a lot of research. So I did a lot of Stephanie Seneff's, like I
Hmm.
looked into her research, and there's definitely correlations with a lot of disease and glyphosate spraying. And then I saw how much it's used in the world aside from just in the crops. Like they spray, like Roundup is sprayed on our schoolyards, and then the half-life is like 15 days, or I forget how much, it might be more than that.
In
So when they
Florida, it's pretty quick. Yeah, it breaks down. But in other places, it can
Okay.
be in the soil for years. So it
Okay.
depends on the climate and the soil, and
And
there's
that makes
different.
sense. And so when kids are stomping on the ground, they're inhaling direct
Mhm.
Roundup, right? Or
Yeah, yeah.
glyphosate. What's interesting about glyphosate, so there is a test you could do. One of them, like Great Plains Labs, they have this urine test. And so I actually don't specifically track that, only because my clients don't eat any like grains and stuff or anything that uses that. Now they might eat meats that have the genetically use the crops and stuff that had the glyphosate spray.
Yeah. Hmm.
What's interesting about that research though is, so the way that glyphosate works is that it sprays, it basically kills off a pathway called the shikimate pathway, and so
Yep.
then it kills off the plants, right? So there are three aromatic amino acids, and those protect against the damage of at least, I believe, human cells or animal cells, and that will protect you from the damage of glyphosate. So obviously, this is totally logic reasoning, but I thought, well, if the animals are consuming the glyphosate because of their levels of tryptophan, and I forget what the other aromatic amino acids are, maybe their bodies are protecting themselves so that by the time we eat it, we're not really getting the exposure to glyphosate, because again, that pathway is not really, their bacteria might get affected. So the animal's microbiome would get affected because it kills bacteria cells and
Yeah.
our gut bacteria cells. But in terms of their meat itself, may be protected based on their amino acids. And so therefore, we're not getting as much of the adverse effects of eating these meats, even if they eat glyphosate rich plants and products. And so that's why when people say you can only eat grass finished, it's not necessarily true. They haven't done that research on glyphosate. I forget what the
Interesting.
half
Yeah.
life is in the glyphosate, but it's absolutely
It depends on the soil.
okay.
Yeah. So we live in Plant City, which is known for the Strawberry Festival, and we have
Okay.
strawberries growing all around us. So, and they grow very fast, and they're heavily like irrigated and
Right.
fertilized. So after the workers come in and pick all the strawberries, and they did this on our property. We own a lot of strawberry fields, what used to be strawberry fields. So, and then they come in with these big sprayers and just spray everything. And there's just miles, like square miles of just completely brown. And they
Oh
just
wow.
kill everything. Then they disc it up.
Yeah.
Or no, then they just do a no-till and plant the next crop, but they don't want the weeds to compete.
Yeah.
And this is what they do. This is what I did growing up. I mean, you just spray everything because you don't want the weeds to compete, and then you put down your next crop. But man, yeah, I was exposed to a lot of that stuff,
Oh,
kind of
okay.
growing up, and I always wonder, I guess I did okay, but I don't know what the long term implications are, and I've been meaning to. I live on a farm, and was gonna. What was the name of the test that you measured? Uh,
Um, I'll look it up. It's a
oh,
urine
it's a
test
urine
that,
test. Yeah,
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 it's
yeah,
a urine test that shows
yeah.
how much glyphosate you're releasing. But I think Dr. Stephanie Seneff would be a great person. She's done so much research on glyphosate And I left some of the charts in my book with it, but it's like the correlation with consuming glyphosate rich soy and corn, and then the risks of increase in autism, increases in all these metabolic diseases. And it's pretty scary. It's pretty linear. Yeah, I'll give you that information, but
I've been on several email chains with her,
okay.
communicated a little bit. Yeah. So I thought it was a little bit of fear mongering a few years back, and the more I started paying attention to it, I realized that there's definitely something to this. So
The biggest thing I see is that regardless of when we actually consume it, if it's that scary, it's just the way that the glyphosate, the chemical works, is that it kills off that shikimate pathway,
yeah,
and our bacteria cells, our microbiome has it, and so every time you're
yeah,
eating it, you're eating like a little bit of sanitizer. And so when
yeah,
we get sick without our microbiome, you have to wonder, is it some of that? And it's a lot of people, like you said, they'll spray it like the very end of the crop so that it desiccates faster. So then they could pull
yeah, yeah.
and so it's on there, and then they spray it in our schools, and it's literally sprayed everywhere. I mean, you could get it at
Oh, I
Home
know.
Depot and get Roundup,
Oh
right?
yeah,
So
yeah. I was at Tractor Supply. Yes, I mean it's like first thing you walk in, and they sell the super concentrate in an off-brand because it's no longer under patent. But yeah, I mean I have to admit, I have a little bit at my house, and we have some invasive species that if our cows eat it, they will get very sick
looks
and
sick.
die. So it's the only way to eradicate it. But I try to pull everything out. But I have like a quart bottle, and under occasion I'll use it, but it's not like all around me, like the entire fields are just go brown because they just dump tons of it all over. And that's what can is really that we need to stop that. I mean I realize now, I mean I grew up doing that kind of farming, but we're gravitating a certain amount of years before you can legally become like a regenerative farm. So we're
Right.
moving in that direction, and just everything has been phased out for years, but it takes a while to repair the land.
Yeah. Like I believe our bodies are resilient enough that as we eat the right foods for our body, that it will heal. So even if there's glyphosate in our systems,
Yeah,
that we can get it out. I know for sure that in the book I talk about how long there was somebody that measured the urine in certain people that ate just a standard American diet, and the exponential amount of glyphosate that was found in the urine within 20 years was significantly high. And it's scary because even though I don't really eat a ton of plants, I know I'm getting exposed to it all the time. Even if I go to the kids' playground, right, and I'm jumping around, I'm inhaling it, or my neighbors are
yeah,
using it, and when the wind blows there I'm getting some, right? So
yeah.
it's impossible to not be around, but I just logically is, well, if I just eat less plants then I'll probably get less exposure. Which then I wanted to ask you, so why are you so opposed to the carnivore diet, just out of curiosity? Thanks for listening to part 1 of this 2-part series. Next week, I'll share part 2 of this very interesting ketogenic conversation. You guys know the drill. Make sure to eat a lot of meat. Take care of your bodies because it is the only place you have to live. Stay tuned for next week. Bye.